Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you tonight. My name is Shauna McCabe, and I'm the director of the Art Gallery of Guelph, who is hosting this event tonight. I'm very pleased to be speaking with Charles Pachter and to be having this conversation tonight, 2 days after Indigenous Veterans Day and on the eve of Remembrance Day, a day we acknowledge the courage and sacrifice of all those who have served and continue to serve, and to acknowledge our responsibility to work for the peace they have fought hard to achieve. Before we start this evening, I just would like to remind everyone that we have everyone's video off as well as audio, and to avoid any potential noise. And if you do have questions, and we would welcome lots of questions, please use the Q&A, the question and answer section that's available on your screen, and we will address them a little later in the conversation. I'd like to welcome you all and to offer a land acknowledgement to start. This statement is critical for cultural institutions as it recognizes the history and ongoing impacts of colonialism, as well as the historical complicity of heritage institutions through their approaches to the representation of difference, images and narratives that take on an authority in the public sphere. Typically, a land acknowledgement recognizes the traditional ownership of the lands upon which an event is held. And tonight, as we're gathered over distance, virtually, connected and yet physically dispersed, it is a good moment to reflect on the significance of place wherever we are and how the different traditional lands that we reside in and move through inform our lives. We respect the significance of treaties that continue to affirm the inherent sovereignty of Indigenous nations and recognize our responsibility for the stewardship of the lands on which we live, work, and create. It seemed important to have this conversation today, and in conjunction with our current exhibition of paintings by Charles Pachter called Lest We Forget. Marking a century since the First World War, Charles was approached by the Office of the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario to create a series of paintings about the war to end all wars and its legacy for Canadians. 6 of these large-scale works are on view currently at the Art Gallery of Guelph, which were donated generously by Charles Pachter to the gallery at the end of 2019. And we're very pleased to be able to share the works with the public so quickly. And I'll just show you a few images. This is as you walk into the gallery. And this is the full space. I also want to say a little bit about Charles Pachter. He is a painter, a printmaker, sculptor, designer, historian, and lecturer, and is one of the most collected and cherished Canadian artists. He studied French literature at the Sorbonne, art history at the University of Toronto, and painting and graphics at the Cranbrook Academy of Art in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. His work has been shown at the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Royal Ontario Museum, the McMichael Canadian Art Collection, as well as many other venues. His iconic and patriotic images that have also independently earned their place in national museums, as well as those internationally. He's represented in public and private collections throughout Canada and internationally. His work has also been featured in solo exhibitions in France, Germany, Japan, the UK, India, and Bangladesh. I wanted to start too by just giving a sense of his wider practice. Charles Pachter, Charles, you've been painting for several decades at this point, and really, I was telling Charles before we started that there's sort of a kind of a really compelling arc to his work. He's well known for his playful approach to the representation of figures and landscapes associated with Canada. He's actually spent most of your creative life capturing this kind of iconography that is very much about Canada and speaks to Canadian experience. The Queen often appears in your work as well. The painted flag. This is from 1981. And what's interesting is if you look at Charles's work, you see these images recur in different contexts in different ways over time. This is Moose Crossing, very, very familiar to us. Baywatch, Canadian Tire, which is actually in the image. You're in behind you in your home there. the canvas house, Red Barn at Oro. Now, while you've been creating this visual mythology out of Canadian history and culture with often very playful approach, the series Lest We Forget is much more contemplative, I would say. And I'm wondering, just with this image, maybe could you talk about how the project came about?
Yes.
Yes.
I think the easiest thing would be for me to read from a very short essay that I wrote in the original catalog for the exhibition that opened at Queen's Park in 2014, 100 years after the start of the war. And here's what I wrote. Where have all the soldiers gone? Gone to graveyards, everyone. Oh, when will they ever learn? When will they ever learn? That's Pete Seeger's song, Where Have All the Flowers Gone? Recently, I created a series of paintings examining the War of 1812 between the young United States and Britain's North American colonies that resulted in the birth of a new Canadian identity. A century later came the First World War. And a century after that, I was approached by the Office of the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario to consider painting a series about this war to end all wars that defined our emerging colonial nation with even more profound and tragic consequences. If this was Canada's coming of age, its profound rite of passage, I needed to know why fighting for the British Empire was seen to be such an act of courage and loyalty, why young men from across the vast reaches of our sparsely populated country of just 8 million people left for the battlefields of Germany, France, and Belgium to be wounded, slaughtered, and if they survived, traumatized for life. For months, I pored over letters written by young soldiers from the trenches, diaries of courageous nurses, and dour military reports of the appalling number of casualties among Canada's young soldiers. My thoughts turned to a painting I remembered from childhood by Group of 7 war artist Frederick Varley, titled For What?, which depicts a grisly pile of mutilated corpses in a cart sitting in a filthy quagmire awaiting hasty burial. The more I read, the more I pondered war as the low point of human existence. How different are we from the apes? How have we evolved, if at all? Is killing for territory and dominance an inevitable characteristic of human behavior? After much sifting of ideas, I chose not to depict the violence and savagery of the battlefields, the exploding shells, the gunfire, the rotting corpses, and the agony of the wounded and dying. Instead, I chose a path of meditation on war as metaphor. Wordsworth's phrase, emotion recollected in tranquility, often came to my mind. 100 years later, could I evoke this war as a metaphor for human frailty? Could I transform misery and suffering into something powerful, poetic, and metaphysical? An excerpt from John McCrae's celebrated poem, In Flanders Fields, kick-started my subconscious. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. My challenge was to get up close and personal with the warrior, to put myself in his boots, to get my head inside his brain, to feel what one lone soldier felt confronting his rage, his fear, his mortality. And I wondered also how the stoic nurses, the healers, survived deprivation, discomfort, shock, how they must have needed and clung to each other for friendship and moral support. I tried to imagine myself in the position of a half-naked soldier contemplating the possibility of his demise. Death be not proud, wrote John Donne nearly 400 years ago. In Shakespeare's Hamlet, for in that sleep of death, what dreams may come. The same themes kept haunting me. Trench, gas mask, tank, tent, nurse, warplane, battleship. I refer to my painting style as reductionist symbolism, whereby I try to reduce an idea to its essence. I have attempted a Zen-like examination of pure form, inspired and motivated by the above themes. I have endeavored to meld the left and right sides of my brain, the analytic and the emotional, to come together to invite contemplation of the eternal questions based on the subject painted. What is war? What is peace? What is life? What is death? What is love? What is hate? What is existence? What is transcendence? What is deliverance? And finally, what is hope and what is joy? So that was the essay wherein I tried to express the feelings that I had while I was doing all this research and reading letters and diaries and looking into this past and trying to make sense of how this young colonial nation of only 8 million people sent these young kids overseas to be slaughtered and killed. To look at some statistics today, Canada right now is 35 million people, and we have lost 10,000 to COVID-19. In 1918, Canada was only 8 million, and we lost 61,000 soldiers. It's hard, it's almost unfathomable to think at the quantity of death and dying that existed at that time. And we're not even talking about the Second World War here, when tanks and planes and were much more sophisticated. But as a young nation, how we were able to give up our youth for this cause was just, for me, a question that I couldn't quite understand. And through the paintings, I tried to explore that mindset.
So, and with this one, this first painting, Emblem,
Yeah.
when you saw from when we installed the exhibition, we put it sort of, the first image. We really, I think to our minds, it was the first image, but perhaps was it the first image for you in creating the series? It's the poppy is has such an enduring symbol of remembrance.
Well, I called it Emblem, and it has its roots in many different artists' attempts to paint flowers. You all know about Andy Warhol's flowers and Van Gogh's irises and sunflowers. But the poppy is more central to Canadian consciousness than any other flower, in the sense that it represented the sacrifices of all of our soldiers. And I reduced it to a very simple, pure form. The painting is 48 by 48 inches. It's a big painting, 4 feet by 4 feet. And the simplicity of it gives it that Zen quality that I came to be very pleased with. And I was using contrasting colors, the turquoise against the brilliant red and the black. Remember, I had started painting our flag back in 1981, and I believe that everything you do in life, whether you know it or not, is a rehearsal for the next thing. So I was very comfortable doing this painting after I thought and rethought, what am I going to paint about this war? What will resonate? What will make people stop and think? What will be endearing? What will be enduring? What will be lasting? And the title, Emblem, hence that title.
And it's so clear that, what you mentioned when you were in your essay about this, your approach to painting being kind of a distillation of ideas, right? It's so clear in this particular work.
Well, don't forget, I was brought up in the era of pop art when I was anybody said, pardon my indulgence, but if any of your viewers want to go to my website, which is www.cpachter.com, I talk about the fact that in my early years, in my 20s, I was very much influenced, without realizing it subconsciously, by my DNA from my immigrant grandparents who left poor villages in Eastern Europe and Russia to come to Canada. My maternal grandmother came to Alberta in 1914 at the start of the First World War, and she was still alive when I was a teenager. And I always make fun of this fact that my immigrant granny called me Charles because she thought Charles was plural. And my family always made jokes about that, her calling me Charles. But as the grandson of immigrants, I was trying to make sense of how this country dealt with newcomers, and especially look at Canada today and our big cities, how we are the world's last best hope, a society of decency and dignity, which we should never ever take for granted. How lucky we are to live in the kind of freedom that we do, and acceptance and inclusivity. I'm very proud of this country in that way. When I first started to think about the flag, well, let's go back to the early days. I talked about my early work. I'm jumping all over. Before, in my 20s, I was doing a lot of expressionist work, which harkened back to the world of my grandparents. You could think of people like Kata Kolowitz, a lot of what I call, if it's okay to say this on air, my early fucked up period. I was trying to sort myself out in my 20s and trying to figure out, how did I become an artist? Why did I become an artist? Again, I make all these droll jokes. My mother saw me on the floor painting at age 10 when the other kids were outside in the summer playing in the yard. And she said, "You want to paint? Paint the bridge chairs. Do something useful." But it took forever for me to try and make some sense of where I was going as an artist. And my early work, which many of your viewers may know, I was lucky enough to meet Margaret Atwood at summer camp when I was 16 and she was 19. And I fell in love with her poetry. She used to send me her poems all the time. And when I went off to graduate school in the United States at the Cranbrook Academy of Art, a very elite school, one of the beautiful American campuses from the 30s, I spent all my time doing my MFA based on illustrating Margaret's poems, which were, in my opinion, and I still believe, brilliant. And the final result of those 6 limited edition folios that I did at Cranbrook were, I was working at Expo 67 in Montreal when Margaret was in Boston, and she sent me the manuscript for her longer poem, The Journals of Susanna Moodie. And I was so overwhelmed by its brilliance that I knew everything I had done up until then was a rehearsal for what I wanted to do for the Journals of Susanna Moodie. And it took me nearly 2 years to print the images. I brought printers over from Spain, and we worked on the book for 9 months, from February till October of 1980. And the book came out in 1980. I'm going to indulge the readers with one poem that might make them want to read the full Atwood. You all know about the cholera epidemic in the 1840s and the Irish who came to Toronto at the time. Margaret's poem about that epidemic is called Further Arrivals. After we had crossed the long illness that was the ocean, we sailed upriver. On the first island, the immigrants threw off their clothes and danced like sandflies. We left behind, one by one, the cities rotting with cholera, one by one, our civilized distinctions, and entered a large darkness. It was our own ignorance we entered. I have not come out yet. My brain gropes nervous tentacles in the night, sends out fears, hairy as bears, demands lamps, or waiting for my shadowy husband, hears malice in the trees whispers. I refuse to look in a mirror. I need wolf's eyes to see the truth. Whether the wilderness is real or not depends on who lives there. Now, this brilliant poem triggered my imagination, and unfortunately, we don't have a picture of it to show you tonight. But if you go onto my website and you click on books, you will see the entire Journals of Susanna Moodie. And I owe so much to Margaret. She was my muse when I was a kid. And bless her heart, here we are 60 odd years later, still buddies and lifelong friends. And I have nothing but admiration for her. She is truly a genius. So, getting back to your question, yes, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yes, well, here's what happened. I'm talking about pop art. Up until in 1966, I graduated from the Cranbrook Academy of Art. My professor, I stood first in my class, and my professor in Detroit said, "Man, what are you going back to Canada for? You should go straight to New York." And I said, "There's something that might be difficult for you Americans to understand. I love my country, and I want to spend my life raising the bar there." And I came back to Toronto, and I knew the one thing that I wanted to do was get a job at Expo 67. I was 24 years old, and I just knew I had to be there. And it was spectacular. It was like Canada was finally glamorous, and I was part of it, and I was so thrilled. I got to take beer and sandwiches to Alexander Calder when they were installing his enormous stabile, the 70-foot high sculpture on the Inco Plaza at Expo. And I was there for nearly 2 years, and it was the most fabulous time to be in Montreal. And I was lucky because I had gone to the Sorbonne. I had an ear for French, fell in love with the French language and culture. And because I spoke French, I got the job at Expo. So I was really lucky. Fast forward, I finished at Expo, came back to Toronto, had my first show at Gallery Pascal in Yorkville. My second show, my first one was on Markham Street under Jack Pollock in 1964, 68 Doris Pascal. And I was then invited to come and teach at the University of Calgary in 1969. And I drove alone across Canada in a little mini minor. And because I guess I was an impressionable kid still, I was so overwhelmed by the size of the country that I knew something was happening inside my brain. When I got out to Calgary to teach at the university there, I was teaching graphics. I happened to notice that every single Canadian art magazine was full of articles about American pop artists. And I began to contemplate what is the colonial mindset that we were taught to believe when we were students, that if it came from elsewhere, it was consequential. And if it came from here, who do you think you are? That was the colonial mindset. And here I was, the grandson of immigrants, neither French nor English, but grew up in WASP Toronto in the 40s, went to Quebec, où j'ai bien appris cette belle langue après avoir été à la Sorbonne. And I was lucky enough to have dipped into both cultures. I got out to Calgary. I'm reading all these American magazines full of stuff on Wesselman and Warhol and Oldenburg and all of the American pop artists. And I thought, wait a minute, what's going on? Why can't we celebrate our own pop culture? And what did I look at for the first time? Mounties, Fort McLeod, Calgary, Cowgirls, the wheat, the huge storage bins for wheat. And I began to do these paintings in Calgary, which got me going. And I was there for 2 years, came back to Toronto. And what did I think about? When Andy Warhol was busy doing soup cans, and I did the Toronto streetcar. The Red Rocket. We had a big show at the Isaacs Gallery in 1972. It was my most successful exhibition. I was so pleased that these crisp graphic images had become a hit. And the next thing I knew, Ab Isaacs talked me into going up to the Arctic in 1972, a foolish mistake I made. In January, it was 50 below zero. I got pneumonia and pleurisy after 2 weeks. I was supposed to be teaching the Inuit printmaking. I couldn't handle it. I had to be shipped out. I ended up at the Montreal General Hospital. They were on strike. Then I had to have an ambulance take me back to Toronto Western, where I had pneumococcal pneumonia, and I was in the hospital at age 29 for 6 weeks. Thankfully, I recuperated, thanks to a Black nurse from Jamaica in Cape Dorset who gave me ampicillin. My doctor said without the ampicillin, I would never have made it through. Anyway, so I'm recuperating in Toronto, and I decide to go in that summer of 72 to the Gaspé, where there was an eclipse of the sun. I drove all the way out to the Gaspé with friends, and I heard on the radio that the Queen was coming to Niagara-on-the-Lake to open the new Shaw Festival Theatre in June of 1973. And I had an epiphany. I woke up in the middle of the night, and I remember hearing on the radio, Trudeau kept calling her the Queen of Canada. It was the first time that expression was being bandied about. Everybody thought of her as the Queen of England, and then all the colonies. But I had an epiphany, and this is before Photoshop. I ended up with one of those old school projectors, and I projected an image of the Queen trooping the color on a horse, and then I took the horse out on canvas and I put her on a moose instead. Well, I showed these images to Av Isaacs. There were about 10 of them. I was so excited. And would you believe this great champion of Canadian contemporary art said to me, I don't have to show these and I don't have to tell you why. I was shocked that he refused to show them. But in those years, people revered the monarchy and he saw them as irreverent. So what did I do? Andy Warhol was talking to me in my sleep. I had bought my first house on Shaw Street in Toronto for $26,000 in 1969. I renovated it myself after coming back from Calgary, and I decided to open the show the same day the Queen was in Niagara-on-the-Lake, opening the Shaw Festival Theatre, and I called my show The Other Shaw Festival. And a good friend of mine and his wife collected old cars. They had a 54 Rolls Royce. So while Margaret Atwood and Joyce Whelan were pouring tea on the lawn, the Rolls Royce drove up and my friend Larry's wife sat in the back with a glove and a hat waving all afternoon like this. It made headlines in newspapers around the world. So Andy was smiling. The headlines: Canada in royal rage over Queen on Moose. Monarchists threatened to slash canvases. Artists warned to stay indoors. The whole thing was hype and nonsense. And P.S., I never sold one painting. Welcome to Canada. It took 7 years, in 1979, where a brilliant woman from Ottawa that many of you may know, Lorraine Monk, who started the Canadian Museum of Photography, moved to Toronto, befriended me, came over one day to my studio, saw the original painting of the Queen on the Moose, which I think you just showed, and said to me, how much do you want for that? I said, I don't know, $1,500. She said, I'm not giving you that. I said, oh, what will you give me? She said, I'm paying you $10,000. It's the most important piece of post-colonial pop art to have ever been produced in this country. P.S. Lorraine is now 95 with Alzheimer's in a hospice. Her kids are in their 60s and they're fighting over the painting. Right. It does belong at the National Gallery someday, but not while I'm alive, right, or not while the Queen is alive. It will, or Lorraine. It'll be history someday, and it'll be part of our evolution from colony to nation, and me trying to explore the psyche of the nation. And the Queen on the Moose was the first image to do that. And P.S., I made another 15 to 20 variations on it, unabashedly, unapologetically, because it became so popular. And you have probably seen my most recent one, which was done in 2015. It's called Decisions, Decisions. It's on my website. And she's standing back to the viewer in her chenille bathrobe at her IKEA cupboard looking at all of her hats, trying to decide which hat to wear. That has been a huge hit. But I can proudly say that that image of the Queen on the Moose, in the last 40 years, I've easily earned $2 million from it.
Right.
And I'm so proud of that. And I'm proud that it's become part of the contemporary canon. Simple as that. And after I did the Queen on the Moose, I started doing just the moose. It was eatable. I decided it was time to get the Queen off the moose's back and to make the moose this majestic, solitary creature as an allegory for the Canadian identity into a special symbol. And I did just that. Some of my best known paintings, there's one called Tour de Force of a moose on a tightrope walking over the CN Tower. Another one of a moose on a diving board. I had such fun. They were my sort of Chagall type mooses, flying and jumping and at the brink of huge cliffs, ready to jump. All of them, these sort of symbolic images, where the moose being a representative of the Canadian psyche. After the moose came, well, I'd already talked about the streetcar, the moose. Then I was doing portraits in the 70s and 80s of Peter Newman and Margaret Atwood and June Callwood. So many well-known Torontonians, many of whom are now no longer with us. But I bought a farm up in Oro-Medonte, an hour north of Toronto. I read Richler's The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz, where this Jewish kid from Montreal ends up buying a 100-acre farm and thinks he's arrived. And I decided I had to have a 100-acre farm too. I bought this rundown farm, which needed so much work. It was in Oro Township, and I named it Oro Fixation. And I used to do summer Canada Day parties up there with all the artists from Queen Street, and would come for déjeuner sur l'herbe, for luncheons on the grass. And I'd go into Aurelia to buy butter tarts and go to the Goodwill, the best butter tarts in Ontario from Aurelia. But that's open to argument, of course. Many people would differ, but it's Wilkie's in Aurelia. Anyway, I did a whole series of paintings called Figures in a Landscape, and had a show in 1979 on Queen Street called Figures in a Landscape. And then one night at the farm in 1981, I had bought a rayon flag at Canadian Tire in Aurelia, and I had an old 2x4, and I stuck it in a fence post hole, and I was lying on a hammock at twilight, and the flag started to move in the light, and I had another epiphany. It's so much more organic and beautiful when it's waving in the wind under the influence of light. And I started to paint the flag. And I painted and painted and painted. And in that same year, I was at the height of my Queen Street empire. I had opened a restaurant. If you want me to stop talking about all this and talk about the art, just tell me.
I was just going to connect this to the flag when you're finished on.
Oh, I see. Yes, thank you. Okay. Yeah, the two banners there. I used that image for John McCrae, of course, who was from Guelph. And I've had fun. And I also did it in a painting of the War of 1812 called Dressed to Kill.
Right.
A soldier seen from the back with the two banners. But what I discovered was that the flag in motion was so much more poetic and organic than stationary. And I finished 30 paintings, and at the time I had opened a restaurant on Queen Street called Gracie's, which only lasted 18 months, because when we started, the borrowing costs were 10%, and when we were forced to close, they were 23%. It was a nightmare. And I had built a brand new, elegant building, gallery on the main floor called the IGA Galleries, because it used to be an IGA supermarket. And I opened my show with a painted flag in these glamorous new galleries. Toronto had never seen anything like it. On November the 7th, 1981. Oh my goodness, we're so close. It's 39 years ago, almost to the night, when my show opened, the day after Pierre Trudeau had announced the patriation of the Constitution. And all of the Toronto art world was there. Barbara Frum, Pierre Burton, Margaret Atwood, Peter Zosky, June Callwood, most of them now no longer with us. And the Toronto that I once knew has disappeared because it's now a city of 5 million people. And it's a living miracle because it's 2/3 newcomers, 2/3 visible minorities to people from all over the world. And it's Canada at its most accepting and most decent and dignified. But having said all that, the Toronto that I once knew is no longer there. The show opened in 1981, and I was savaged in the press, in the Globe and Mail, by John Bentley Mays, the then art critic of the Globe and Mail. And he said, among other things, more over-the-couch art for the walls of patriotic dentists. At which point, Bluma Appel, who was one of my biggest collectors, fabulous woman, Montrealer, had moved to Toronto and owned a whole bunch of my work. Bluma was ready to sue the Globe and Mail. She thought he was being so nasty. She thought it was slander. But because of John Bentley Mays, later on, and this is why I repeat that whatever you do in life, whether you know it or not, is a rehearsal for the next thing. I invented the name of a fake art critic with a double-barreled hyphenated name. Hint, he comes from Three Rivers, and his name, Don Rouge Humber. You have to be from Toronto to get it. Those are the Three Rivers in Toronto. And I would take out ads in the Globe and Mail when I opened my own gallery here, the Moose Factory, in 1998. And I would make up these fake quotes from Don Rouge Humber. So stunning, words fail me. A legend in his own mind. A mnemonic mimesis of moose imagery. Would go on and on like that. So I had such fun with that. Thank you for using Adobe Flash Player. Remind me later. Thank you. I don't know what that's all about.
We should maybe keep going on the series just to
yes.
address.
Okay. Now, how do we get back onto the large screen again? Are you still with me? Can you see me?
We can still see you.
Okay. I don't know what happened to the large screen. Zoom is here. Update to 5 now. Should I do that?
Don't update right now.
Okay. How do I get that to open again? Let's just see. Well, maybe I don't have to. I can look at the little. Thumbnail, but I'm curious to know how come I lost the big screen.
You lost it. It might be trying to update, but.
All right, I'm going to go update to 5. Let's see if it comes back. Download Zoom client for meetings.
If with the portrait of John McCabe, I was saying this is so significant to Guelph, and is this the reason that you thought about? You know, obviously you had the Art Gallery of Guelph in your mind as a place for this.
Yes.
You know, and I know that, you know, over the years that, you know, in Flanders Fields has been, you know, has been interpreted in different ways and taken on new meaning.
Yes.
From a call to remembrance to a call for peace. In creating this series and reflecting on McCrae and his poem and the poppy as a symbol, did you sort of think in terms of a call to action or a call for peace specifically? I guess from your essay, it was more a reflection on peace, perhaps.
I was so impressed with McCrae's poem. I'd put him right up there with Atwood. I think he was brilliant in doing that. And I mean, it's only the most famous Canadian poem that I can think of. And it's so haunting and so beautiful. That I wanted to pay him homage. I wanted to do something. And that's when I used the 2 banners of the new flag. And I thought it worked.
One of the things I was noting about, you know, I guess the sort of departure in your work in this image, as well as other works in this series is, you know, instead of sort of the kind of the pop aesthetic, you've also, there's a representational element, right? You've captured the features, and it's almost in terms of like depicting a sculpture, a monument, for example. It was just an observation I had because it's a departure for you, really.
Well, with the Trench Letter, which is an enormous 3-panel triptych, I thought so long about that. How could I get to the essence of these poor kids in these muddy trenches in the dark, attempting to write a letter home? And there's a lot of power in that triptych. And I'm not just saying this because I'm talking to you, but I'm so pleased with the installation at the Art Gallery of Guelph. It's such a lovely marriage of the painting and the space. And this means so much to an artist to have that beautiful complementary space for that painting. The three large ones are Cortege, The Healers, Trench Letter, and Dazzle, the boat.
Yeah.
And I just, you know, aside from the subject matter, I had such a good time with the compositions and just creating an aura around each painting that I'm that much prouder to see them hanging where they are. I'm just thrilled. And I'm not to embarrass you, but Shauna, you did fabulous due diligence in getting these paintings where they belong. And for me, it's legacy stuff. I'm going to be 78 next month. I'm in good health, thank goodness. But this is when, in your last quarter, this is when artists have to start thinking about where should their best works go. And the fact that they should be seen in public institutions is the prime consideration. And so from that point of view, I'm so grateful.
You're welcome for that. Question about this one. You know, I guess one of the things, when you think about younger generations, they probably had no sense of trench warfare, that battles were fought on the ground and in the ground, basically. Was that, you know, capturing that, you know, part of what you were, you know, capturing experiences that we don't have sort of physical or visual records of? Again,
I just thought the trying to put myself in that space with the gunfire and the filth and the cold in France, Belgium, Germany, just the sheer atrocity of having to deal with that on an extended period of time. And then whoever survived ending up with PTSD, you know what that is, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Mm-hmm.
I did do a painting called Lament, which I think you had as part of that as well, with a sort of crumpled up figure on a bed. That was also bought by the collector in Bangladesh.
Right.
But for me to be able to address this kind of work with gravity and seriousness, rather than me being playful. I did do one droll image, as I think you have seen. You can put it up on the screen there, called Conclusion. And it's a big handwriting with the moose's
right.
skeleton. It's about mortality, and it says, so I guess that's it then.
Yeah.
That's another Pachterism.
Yeah. Yes. We'll get to that one. That's at the very end, but
yeah.
We will show that. Someone's actually also asked to see the Queen on the Moose, and I'll go back to that as we near the end as well. Let's talk about Dazzle. I was saying this is one of my favorite paintings of yours in this series because of the history of the painting of Dazzle ships. You know, painting the ships themselves, but then also recording Dazzle ships in visual art. So.
Yeah. The question again?
Just do you want to talk about this painting? And it's this one's very pop art and refers to
which one?
Dazzle.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that just pushed all my buttons as soon as I saw some sketches of it. They were just yellowed sketches. And I thought a lot about Futurism and Boccioni and Art Deco, and even Fred Astaire movies. I mean, it had that look about it from the 20s and the 30s. So this is a little earlier. But I guess to be a little self-indulgent, I didn't know a lot about battleships. All I knew is I wanted to paint that. I wanted to color it with my palette and turn it into the turquoise and black and white and yellow. And I just got a lot of pleasure from painting it. Mm-hmm. And they were painted that way for camouflage way back when. Mm-hmm. Hard to believe, eh?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And you can you talk a little bit about the difference, why you chose diptychs or triptychs in some cases?
Yeah. Well, I have to be frank about that as well. When I went to the Lieutenant Governor's suite in Queen's Park and I saw this huge 19th century space with 15-foot high walls. And I asked them, could I do these large images? And they were very cooperative about it. And David Onley, who was then Lieutenant Governor, was just before his term ended. They did a couple of magnificent receptions for the show, and they brought in 95-year-old veterans, which was very touching. And the show was extended. It went on for 9 months at Queen's Park. And then it moved on. I took 3 of the paintings to London in 2016 and 8 of them to Bangladesh in 2018. So they've traveled quite a bit. They've seen the world.
These are some that are not in the exhibition, but Airborne, with the plane.
Yes. I have to be honest, I still own Airborne. I like it a lot. It doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily about war, but it was the first war where those little biplanes were used. And I just have a certain affection for it. We'll talk, maybe in a year or two, I might let Guelph have it, we'll see.
That's interesting. Yeah. Also, you know, your interest in the sky, you know, it reminds me of your flag paintings with the sort of the vivid blue sky behind.
Yes.
It's always behind the backdrop. Right?
Yeah. I have worked for many decades in flat color, where I juxtapose an image which may be volumetric, like a portrait or an object, with a flat background. An American artist who has done similar work is Alex Katz. But my work, he said subjectively, I think my work is a little more partially intellectual, and it has different layers of meaning which are there for the viewer to interpret.
Right.
I would have very much liked to have shown these paintings at the War Museum in Ottawa. There was a gentleman who came from the War Museum and saw the show at Queen's Park, and he said he loved everything, but they had a policy that they only showed artists from that time, you know, whether it was Varley or Jackson, whoever painted war from that very time. But I think it might be interesting someday to be able to show them in Ottawa.
Right. I've just opened up Tank Top here.
Yes. That's another one of my surrealist images of a nurse wearing a tank on her head. It's just, for some reason, it reminded me of some of the ladies' hats of the period. That's what I did. Yeah.
The next one is Night, the Canvas House 1, and then we have Night, the Canvas House 2. So
yes.
Tents.
I was fascinated by many of the letters written from inside tents on cold, windswept, muddy fields. And of course, the tent goes all the way back to Governor Simcoe, who brought a canvas house to the wilds of Upper Canada, to Ontario, and lived in it at the foot of Bathurst Street for several years. But I became fascinated by the architecture of the tent. And these may be a little removed from the horror of war and everything else, but they were pure form, paintings of pure form. Yeah. And I really enjoyed playing with titles. One of them I called To All Intents. And the other, of course, The Canvas House.
These are so vivid and really kind of, you know, architectural.
Yeah. I was glad to include them with the other paintings of the suffering.
Right.
That one cortege is so haunting, of these poor guys coming back from a gas attack. That was one that, yeah.
And here I have Gasp now.
Gasp. Yeah, that's probably the most gruesome. That you can see the look in the horse's eye. Even the horse is terrified. And the dog, they had to protect their animals. And they all wore these masks. It was the first war that had gas as the gas attacks with that. And many people suffered from it and had permanent injuries from it. Hard to believe, unfathomable.
It is. Here's one of the painted flag.
Yes. Now our flag, as you know, came in 1965 after a very emotional fight in Parliament between the Liberals and the Conservatives, John Diefenbaker and Lester B. Pearson. They called it the Pearson Pennant. But I remember at the time, I think I was 23 years old when we got the new flag, and how proud I was that we finally got an image that we could call our own. I had nothing against the Union Jack and our Ontario flag, but I felt the time had come. Like we had grown, we had changed, we had emerged. We had a textbook in school called Canada from Colony to Nation. And I know how upset John Diefenbaker was about the new flag. And here's an irony. There is a Diefenbaker Museum at the University of Saskatchewan, and I donated a painting that I did of the Diefenbakers welcoming the Kennedys to Ottawa Airport in 1960, called Obscure Canadian Historical Event, and a painting, a huge painting of the new Canadian flag. And they're both now hanging in the John Diefenbaker Museum in Saskatoon.
That's great.
Pleased about that, yeah.
That's great. Pieta, want to talk a bit about that one?
Now, which one is that?
Pieta.
Pieta, yes. That is now in the Charter House in London, where I had many of these paintings. It's a 15th century building that became an almshouse and later housed many soldiers from the First World War, wounded soldiers. And they were so gracious to me and did such a beautiful job installing the exhibition. It was in August and September of 2016 that I donated it to the museum, and that's where it is now. And I called it Pieta, of course, because the nurse is the lifesaver and the wounded soldier, the young wounded soldier.
Mm-hmm. It's also, a reminder, the healers, that painting as well, when you look at these together, that, the role that women played in the war and, just the other dimensions of war, how it's so all involving for a country.
Well, I did read many nurses' diaries, and honestly, I was so moved by the descriptions of how they had to deal with these young boys with mangled bodies coming in, and how they had to remove limbs, and how they had to do all kinds of horrible operations without the use of good anesthetics in the field. The suffering is indescribable. We are so spoiled. The wars we have now are like millions of miles away inside our heads as to what they went through on the battlefields then. Second World War still had it. The Korean War still had it. But times have changed so much now that they'd rather just blow somebody up with a bomb and kill 200,000 people at once, But we have to ask ourselves once again, how much better are we than the apes? Do we kill for territory? Do we kill for power? Is might win over right all the time? And look what happened in London in the Second World War, how the royal family had to leave, and how so many people, and the bombing from Germany. I mean, it's hard for us to imagine all of this in 2020. This kind of gruesome human activity. Is war our lowest point of human behavior? And here we are now with COVID. Ironically, what is it? How many have died all over the world now? 300,000 or something? Out of a population of 7 billion. It's infinitesimal compared to what we went through in the two world wars.
Do you think, given that we've lost the generation that was directly involved in World War I, and losing touch with both world wars, do you think that creative practices have a greater role to play and in documenting?
I would hope that anybody who gets to stand up close and personal with my paintings, that it would cause them to ponder the meaning of life and death, and how at our worst we create death rather than life. And where does this mindset come from? And will we ever change? When you think about the universe and how infinitesimal it is, and how on Earth, let's face it, a third of the wars are because of religious fanaticism. And at what point, I'm a happy pacifist agnostic, so it's kept me feeling liberated and not worrying about a lot of the dogma of religion. But I still wonder whether we will ever move on to a higher level and become more enlightened in time, having learned from these horrible events. I do believe even now, when you see people praising, you know, we've got these clubs like the Royal Canadian Military Institute, and we do praise the military in some ways because of how they've defended our country. But in what way should we praise the military? And maybe someone from the military would like to respond back to that. But there is a kind of a set idea that they are our heroes because they protected us against tyranny and against oppression. And in many ways, that's been Canada's great stay and strength, that we are peacekeepers. We try very hard to retain that role.
I have Lament up right now.
Yes. There is a crumpled figure on a bed suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. He may have survived the wounds and the killing and the shelling, but he lives with it for the rest of his life. That's what PTSD is. And I tried to give some sense of that. Just that one image of the figure shattered a bit, lying alone on a bed. Again, emotion recollected in tranquility, trying to understand the meaning of all of this. Why did we do it? What were the results? Did we move on to a higher level? Have we learned enough from war to help us to get better, to be better, to respect one another more, to deal with so-called enemies in a more enlightened way? There you have it. That's an artist's thought.
And then the final image is the moose, the skeletal moose.
That's me being somewhat mischievous again, like my usual self, a little play on words. The expression, so I guess that's it then, a kind of admission of mortality, actually comes from a funny other line at Thanksgiving, when after a 12-course meal, my mother would bring out the prunes and my father, and she'd say, "This is for your digestion." And my father would say, "Well, I guess that's it then." The end of the meal. But I played around with that image and with that phrase, because I love working with phrases and words as well. I have a whole series of word paintings. But there's something ironic and, you know, underneath a little bit of humor is a probe, trying to figure out once again, what is the meaning of life? We're only all here for 70 or 80 or 90 years. Then it's somebody else's turn to take over. It's not our turn anymore. And I'm just hoping that I was able to record my time with a poetic visual sense and an enduring love of painting that will live on. Ars longa, vita brevis. Latin, art endures, life is short.
We have a question actually from Terry Williams. He says, "Thank you so much for the insights you've offered into your body of work. I'm interested to know how you might imagine the iconography that you've created changing or evolving in the years to come. I'm thinking specifically of how your work will enter further into conversation with the steadily diversifying community of artists we are so fortunate to have in Canada. The images you've created and worked with are so central to our visual identity and sense of nationhood. And as that identity itself evolves, it's not hard to imagine that this mantle being taken up by others who will bring vastly different perspectives. Do you ever imagine what forms that might take?"
Excellent question and a good point, because we are now living in a world where injustice collecting has become almost a popular pastime, whether it's First Nations, whether it's Indians, whether it's not Indians, women, oppressed minorities, LGBT people. It depends on who you're talking to, but it has become the norm to bring up these injustices, many of which are merited. And I like your viewer's question, because I think so much of the art that we're going to be seeing in the next decades will in fact be, you know, what happened with the residential schools, how women were treated sexually in so many horrible ways, off reserves and First Nation stuff. Many, many artists from those backgrounds are going to be searching out and exploring those issues. And we will be seeing more and more of it in the future, as it should be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's actually, it's, I guess one of the things that I was interested in your work is this, you know, the memory dimension of it. And the other exhibition that we have up currently at the Art Gallery of Guelph is, that parallels this, is called Sites of Memory. And it actually highlights the work of Black, Indigenous, and persons of color who are exploring their own identities and experiences, and looking at those through the lens of memory as well, you know, the kinds of traditions and cultural memories that they're working with. So I really see these two projects in dialogue with each other in some ways.
I think this is great, and I think we are ready for more of these kinds of insights from people who have experienced issues that they would like to recreate, whether in images, in film, in photography, in music, whatever, that the creative genius of humans is just waiting for people to utilize, to do stuff with this. And I'm looking forward to seeing more and more of it.
We have another question here. How did you come to decide to use pastels in these pieces?
Interesting. That's a pragmatic question about my materials. I was always a printmaker. I started as a printmaker drawing on lithographic stones with something called touche, T-U-S-C-H-E, which is a suspension of ink, of grease in liquid, and crayons. And I was always comfortable drawing. And in my own technique, I managed to create my... It was a combination of colored pencil, pastel, which I would then spray with Krylon varnish and fixative. And then I could paint over it with a mixture of acrylic and acrylic gels, and work it. And then once I'd finished the central image, surrounded in flat color. That became my modus operandi. That was what I enjoyed doing.
And another question here from Susan Davidson. The Lament pose reminds me of a crucifixion, but one of the soul. Am I reading something into it?
You're being very perceptive. It has that vibe. It certainly does. There is one called Across the Lake. I don't think it's what's shown tonight, but it does look like a Christ figure standing in front of a very rough, choppy lake. And it has that vibe to it. There's no question. Yeah.
I think that is all of the questions we have from the audience. I just wanted to, I guess we're at 8 o'clock, so perhaps we should sign off, but I just wanted to thank you, Charles, so much for the conversation and for the background on the work and your own practice. You know, I think it's so important to kind of, you know, especially this time of year, but really every day, to be thinking about, you know, Canada's commitment to the war effort and the consequences for those involved that you evoke so clearly and poetically in your work. I'd like to invite everyone to come to the Art Gallery of Guelph to see Lest We Forget, of the paintings that we have on view here. It's now on view until January 10th, 2021. So if you can't make it now, you've got a little while to come visit. Anyway, I would like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. And thank you, Charles. I don't know if you have anything you want to say.
I'd just like to sign off and say how truly grateful I am that you folks did such a wonderful installation. And I honestly say, pardon my chauvinism, it's worth the drive to Guelph. It really is worth going to see how beautifully installed it is. And I hope you'll have a guest book so people can put some comments in. But I'm honored and proud to have the show there. And I think it's ended up where it belongs. And for that, I'm truly grateful.
Well, thank you so much.